So, warmly welcome everyone to today's webinar discussion on security, human rights in Eastern Europe, which effectively is about the protracted conflicts and the significance and relevance of these for European security and European security order. I'm very happy to host this seminar on behalf of the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies in Stockholm at the Swedish Institute for International Affairs, together with OSW and PISM in Warsaw, the Center for Eastern European Studies, OSW, and the Polish Institute for International Affairs. Today's topic is probably more topical and timely than ever, with Russia's escalation towards Ukraine ongoing and one of the largest security crises in European security for quite some years. And also, as we have seen, yet another manifestation or expression or formulation of the Russian demands or red lines as they were expressed by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs last week. This is a project which has been running over a year and has been a flagship project of the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies, with all in all 9 reports and a 10th summary report, which will be introduced by my colleague John Sachow later on today. And I would like to especially thank Dr. Andreas Omland and Dr. Martin Krag, who are the initiators of this report series and this project, which actually started and was initialized even before Stockholm Centre of Eastern European Studies was established. There's also, we will discuss many aspects of this and not focus particularly on the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian crisis, as interesting and relevant as it is, but try to put this in the larger political perspective and what this means together with the other conflicts. Since these conflicts are all in one way or another related to OSCE and OSCE is involved in them, there is also an indirect connection to the outgoing Swedish OSCE chairpersonship and the incoming Polish OSCE personship. So therefore, it's very good to have this bridge today between the sort of Swedish analytical expertise community and our Polish colleagues at the OSW and PISM here today. There are many interesting aspects of this, and I think we all realize now that these conflicts are not some obscure regional, local, ethnic conflicts which are of no greater concern to the rest of Europe and the transatlantic community. And these conflicts, as the title of John's report are open wounds on the European security. And I think that we, the broader international political community, when dealing with these conflicts, we are faced with two sometimes contradictory or not fully coherent political imperatives. On the one hand, there's always the political imperative, especially in the beginning of a conflict, on the need to act, to stop the use of military force, to establish diplomatic negotiation formats and mechanisms. On the other hand, we have the imperative to restore respect for international law and the European security order based on Helsinki Final Act and the Paris Charter and other OSCE commitments. And here a lot of questions arise. How to define the criteria for a solution? Are we today closer to a solution of these conflicts than in comparison as to when they started? Are the existing formats and mechanisms part of the solution or part of the problem? Are we actually dealing with conflict solving, conflict management, or conflict conservation? And we also are all realizing these days that we are not dealing with any kind of frozen conflicts. We are dealing with protracted conflicts, and some of them are hot. And just to mention that over 14,000 people have died in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. In the larger historical perspective, we are in a way dealing with the breakup of Soviet Union, which we just the other day celebrated the 30th anniversary of, which also is a reminder of the idea of a Europe whole, free and at peace, and the post-Cold War security order which is at stake. There are also many other aspects of this: human rights violations, humanitarian tragedies, and so forth. And we also see the relation to the OSCE comprehensive concept of security, how respect for human rights, democracy, and rule of law, on the one hand within countries, and security between states are interrelated. There is a connection between internal repression and external regression. And often the big debate is on how do we define these conflicts, who are the conflict parties, what is the real conflict about? Is it about territorial control, or is it about political control of Russia's neighbors to establish a sphere of influence? There are many questions and also related to, as I said, to the format and mechanisms that we will highlight in today's discussion. First, Dr. Andreas Omland will make some introductory remarks to this report series and this project. And then John Sachau, also at the Stockholm Centre of Eastern European Studies, will present the main findings of his summary report of the other 9 reports in this report series. And then I'm very glad to introduce our discussants, cooperation partners, Anna Maria Dünner from the Polish Institute for International Affairs, where she is an analyst at the International Security Program, followed by Maren Menkishak, head of the Russia department at the Center for Eastern European Studies at OSW. After that, we will have a moderated panel discussions among the panelists here to pick up on some of the questions and aspects they have brought up in their introductory remarks. And then we will open up the floor for comments and questions from the audience. And for those of you who are attending this through Zoom, please use the Q&A function in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. And those of you who are watching this via live stream through Facebook, please send your questions on the comment function, and they will be forwarded to me. We have 90 minutes for this discussion today. The reports can be found and downloaded at the UI homepage, for instance, through the same address where you registered or found information about today's webinar. And I also mentioned that of these 9 reports in the series, we're still waiting for the publications on the 9th one, which is about international law, and especially international humanitarian law, and its applicability to the protracted conflicts, and also how to deal with accountability in relationship to international law. With these words, I would like to hand over the word to Dr. Andreas Omland. Please, Andreas.
Thank you, Frederick. Security and human rights are perhaps the preeminent topics in today Eastern Europe, and especially in what one could call the geopolitical gray zone between the Russian Federation and the European Union. And this project has been our flagship project because we are dealing here with eventually what I would think at least as the most important manifestation of these issues in post-Soviet Eastern Europe, these protracted conflicts. This is not, of course, the only, these are not the only topics that fall under the heading of security and human rights. We had, for instance, also a report on Russia's engagement in Afghanistan, or on the future of the Eastern Partnership Program, or we had a webinar with Vladimir from Vilnius and Anastasia Sergeyeva from Warsaw during the last year at our center. But in a way, this particular subtopic, one could say the protracted conflicts, they are really the main issue here. And the last days or last weeks and the events on the Russian-Ukrainian border, and also around Ukraine, in Ukraine, they are sort of illustrating this just once more. Of course, one could also argue that these conflicts, they are also just expressions of deeper issues, if you like, in the domestic affairs of the involved countries, especially of Russia. There's a good argument to be made for this, and the webinar we had with Vladimir Milov and Anastasia Sergeyeva made that illustrated that well. But still, the conflict now with Ukraine, especially, these are the main manifestations of these issues, these unsolved issues in Eastern Europe. That's why we designed here a series of 10 reports consisting of 3 blocks. The first block on Ukraine, the second on the other unsolved conflicts in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Moldova, and then a third block about the generic issues that are common to all of these protracted conflicts. And we were able to recruit for these reports a number of, I would say, leading experts on the respective issues. I will name them then in a minute, and thereby to create a snapshot over the last year of the situation with these conflicts, both from a regional studies perspective, but also from a sort of disciplinary perspective, from, for instance, international law, the one of the topics that we have not yet published on, but where this week we will finally publish the last substantive report. So these 9 reports, and then the 10th one by John Zachau, which summarized it, dealt first with the first 3 of them with Ukraine as the most sort of salient, perhaps, of these protracted conflicts. We had first a report by Halja Koinash from the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group on human rights issues in the occupied territories of the Donbas, the 2 so-called People's Republics there, and the various issues that people living there and passing the contact line there are facing. Our second report was by Stanislav Aseev and myself on the issues of the prisoners of war and the prisoners' exchanges in the conflict between these Russia-guided separatist entities on the one side and the Ukrainian state on the other side. And the special aspect of this report was that we had here actually a protagonist, or I would now even say a major protagonist of this conflict. Stanislav Aseev, as you may know, has been a journalist, an undercover journalist for Radio Liberty in Donetsk, but has been catched then and put into the most infamous torture prison in the occupied territories, the infamous Izolatia, and some call isolation in translation, concentration camp, as some people say, because there is systematic torture there happening, and this has been also described in this report. And Stanislav Aseev, I forgot to say, is now a link to the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. The third report was on the special monitoring mission of the OSCE in Ukraine, which is of course mainly working in the Donbas. This was also worth a separate report because this is a unique so far operation of the OSCE, and there are many lessons to be learned from it. It's a particularly large mission. We also had then a presentation of this report. We then had a report on the longest conflict of those that we have analyzed here by Victoria Rocha from the Foreign Policy Association of Moldova on the Transnistrian conflict. A very detailed and report on this already more than almost 30-year-old conflict that is, in a way, one could argue, the paradigmatic case, and where basically already Russia was exercising long before Putin came to power some of the practices that later then we learned in the course of the other conflicts. The fifth report in my counting here it was by Diana Janse from the Free World Forum in Sweden on the two conflicts in Georgia around Abkhazia and the Tskhinvali region, better known as South Ossetia. The sixth report was by Stefan Meister from the German Council on Foreign Relations on the Karabakh conflict. We also had on these two reports, or on the last three reports, we then had webinars. The seventh report was by John Zachau on the instrumentalization of the conflicts by Russia for larger purposes that Russia has in the post-Soviet space and even beyond. And John is maybe going to speak about this in more detail. That's why I'm not going to speak here more about this. The eighth report was by Stefan Wolf, professor of international security at the University of Birmingham, on possible solutions or mechanisms, strategies, processes to solve these conflicts. And here, of course, the main focus of this very detailed report, very competent report, was on international organizations, and in particular the formats under the auspices of the OSCE. And the already mentioned final substantive report is forthcoming on the international law and accountability in relation to the protracted conflicts, to be authored by Marika Eriksson and Isak Malm from the Swedish Defense University. This will come out this week. And then, in a way, we are today also presenting John Zachau's final report on this series, about which John will speak in a minute. I may also mention that not only these excellent authors we were able to recruit for these reports, but also some prominent commentators in the webinars that we conducted and that are available on the UI video YouTube site. For instance, Veronica Bart, a prominent Swedish diplomat, William Hill, a former US diplomat who is now at the Kennan Institute in Washington, Vladimir Sokor from the Jamestown Foundation, whom I'm sure you all know, and Svante Cornell for the Institute for Security and Democracy and Policy, who was commenting on the Caucasus. And I may also already announce now that we will going to publish this snapshot in its entirety as a book. We have already concluded the contract with EPDM Press. This is not an academic book. The whole, strictly speaking, many of the contributors and commentators were academics, and certainly it fulfills certain academic standards. But our purpose here was not so much to make a research contribution in an academic sense, but rather to paint a broad picture for policymakers, for journalists, for a larger audience. And this book is then also going to be designed for a larger audience. And I may also say that we are, of course, very, very happy to have here now two more commentators on this project, with Anna Maria and Marek, who will also comment on this. And maybe with that I conclude and give over to Frederick or to John directly for these sort of conclusions from our project.
Thank you very much, Andreas, and now over to you, John. And as Andreas said, the idea of this was to highlight the sort of the policy relevance of these questions, which are far from academic. They are very real and here and now, and a real and present danger to the European security, as we all know, and the implication for the European security order, which John will speak about in a couple of seconds here. And we've also made sure that all the reports also include policy recommendations to various audience, which might be interesting to follow up on. Please, John, what are your main findings and conclusions?
Thank you so much, Fredrik. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the reports first, and then we can go into the policy recommendations afterwards in the discussion. I'd like to start emphasizing what Andreas mentioned, that basically all reports are about the protracted conflicts in Eastern Europe in one way or another, including their wider policy implications. And this also includes the human rights situation, which is particularly severe in and around the non-government controlled areas of these states. And that's worth highlighting. This is a security issue. It's also a human rights issue, and human rights issues are security issues, which we can get back to. I'd also like to point out that there are some differences between these different protracted conflicts, especially the one between Armenia and Azerbaijan is a bit of a separate case. And I'd like to recommend you all to take a closer look at the individual reports to get deeper into the substance. But there are also some striking similarities, and I'd like to focus on a common theme in my introduction here, and that is Russia. As regards the conflict played out in Ukraine, but also the ones in Georgia and Moldova, a key point or finding is that they are very much about Russia. Russia's democracy problems, Russia's lack of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of other states, and for their right to freely choose their security arrangements, including treaties of alliance. Actually, it's even about the right to self-defense, according to the UN Charter, one could argue. And what we have at hand are systematic violations of the commonly agreed rules, the so-called European Security Order, that is of international law and of fundamental OSCE principles and commitments, as defined as in documents like the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris. Russia signed up to these, but violates them and would like to renegotiate them. And as Fredrik pointed out, we're not talking about some local conflicts in some obscure part of the world here, but about an instrumentalization of conflict and a systemic challenge to the European security order and to European security. And we'll also see that there are consequences beyond the region itself. And I'd like to illustrate what I mean by saying a few words about Georgia and Moldova, two countries that should not be forgotten, even though very much is happening now around Ukraine, and that we'll discuss. Anyway, around the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union, hostilities broke out in both Georgia and Moldova. And these hostilities, they clearly had something to do with inter-ethnic or intercultural tensions. I believe it's fair to say this, and there are still some real issues relating to this that need to be dealt with. But, and here's the thing, these conflicts almost immediately acquired a wider geopolitical dimension as Russia and Russian military forces got involved at very early stages. And these forces, which had inherited a previously Soviet military presence, they provided active and probably decisive support to the insurrectionists in the so-called breakaway republics. And ever since, the Russian military presence has continued in both countries. In Georgia, even more so since the war in 2008. And this continues despite the lack of host country consent. That is in violation of Georgia's and Moldova's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Meanwhile, Russia has also provided military, economic, and political support to the so-called breakaway republics. That is to alternative, illegal and illegitimate structures. And Russia has also engaged in various other types of antagonistic behavior towards the legitimate authorities of Georgia and Moldova. And if it wasn't clear from the beginning, it has over time become obvious that Russia is instrumentalizing and perpetuating these conflicts to reach political goals. And for this, it has developed a whole toolbox with similar methods being applied in the two countries. And then later, from 2014 and onwards, also in Ukraine. And in Ukraine, Russia's responsibility and role as a conflict party is even more striking than in Moldova and Georgia. And there, the Russian violations of the European Security Order are also particularly grave, both as regards Crimea and as regards Eastern Donbass. And as we currently see, there's also a worrying risk of a military escalation, with Russian demands for security guarantees from Washington and so on. And as for the methods, the reoccurring methods that I mentioned, I already exemplified by the Russian military forces that appear in different forms, including as so-called peacekeeping forces, following ceasefire agreements that have been brokered or rather dictated by Moscow. Other examples are hybrid measures, such as the mass distribution of Russian passports, propaganda, economic punishment, and so on. It's also important to keep in mind that Russia instrumentalizes not only conflict, but also conflict resolution processes. Through military force and Russian veto power in the UN Security Council and also within the OSCE, Russia has been rather successful in shaping various processes to fit its narrative of these conflicts as something purely domestic. And this means that the peace processes, the conflict resolution processes have become part of the battlefields rather than being the platforms for conflict resolutions that we would like. It's of course relevant to ask what Russia is up to and what Russia wants to achieve through this behavior. And I'll say a few things about that. Sometimes it's argued that the Kremlin lacks a strategic vision. And I would actually disagree with this and argue that this may seem to be the case if one assumes that the Kremlin's priorities are what they are, what would be rational for the Russian population, for Russia as a whole, so to speak, or according to our logic. But if one looks at private rather than public interests, and if one takes the perspective of the Kremlin and its current inhabitants, and if one looks at their rhetoric and actions, then they clearly have another logic with both strategic objectives and a strategic vision. And these objectives are partly external, to establish a sphere of influence over nearby states that should not enjoy full sovereignty. This is also what Putin is now saying publicly by demanding guarantees that certain European states should not be allowed to join NATO, for example. But the objective is also internal. It's about Russian domestic politics, since the Kremlin clearly wants to secure its own survival or security. It wants to prevent what it sees as a virus of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, including the possibility of so-called color revolutions, which is something that the Kremlin sees as existential threats. And in this context, it's important to remember that Russia's external aggression towards other states, it's paired with increasingly harsh repression within Russia. One may look at the actions taken against Navalny and his organization. One could also look at what's going on with Memorial at the moment, and so on. And this important link between conditions within states and security between them is also exactly what the OSCE's comprehensive security system is all about. And ultimately, what this amounts to is a Russian desire to renegotiate the normative European security order. Moscow has signaled this several times. President Medvedev had a so-called European security treaty proposal. What Putin is doing now is the same thing. And I'll just say that at the end now, accepting this either de jure, formally, or only, so to speak, only de facto, implicitly by being silent or reaching some sort of tacit understanding, that would be contrary to what we have previously agreed. And I would argue it would also be very unlikely to bring stability. We need to keep our eye on the ball, that is restoring respect for the established rules. That must be the criterion. Let's not forget about accountability. And let's be very careful with concessions regarding these rules. First, these would not necessarily be accepted by everyone in the affected states. Second, the Russian hunger would probably not be satisfied through any such compromises. If anything, the appetite may just be whetted, since the Kremlin would feel that it's transgressions are paying off. And third, Russia's antagonistic behavior would probably continue anyway, since this is also about ideas and Russian domestic politics. As I mentioned, open democratic societies with respect for human rights, the rule of law, and so on. Even things like gender equality, equity, and sexual freedom, these things are also seen by the Kremlin as threats, not only because of what these societies, open societies do, but also for what they represent. And fourth, and my last point, the risk for instability elsewhere would probably also increase. These ongoing violations, they are matters not just for the countries directly concerned, but also for the rules-based international order in general. Whatever Russia gets away with in Europe, other states may try elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now over to Anna-Maria Dyner, who is an analyst at the International Security Program. Are we dealing with international security here?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Friedrich, for having me here and for invitation. And thank you, Andras and John, for a brilliant presentation and for all project, because it's extremely important, not only for our part of Europe, but I think that also especially for our Western partners who are not, maybe another way, who are lucky not to have a common border with Russia, and they don't have to tackle with such kind of stories in everyday life. So first of all, thank you very much for paying attention to all of those protracted conflicts, and especially that you stress that all of them are backed by Russia, because Russia has plenty of its own interests in maintaining those kinds of conflicts. When we are thinking about Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine, it's very visible that there are three associated with the EU countries. When Russia wants to interfere just to stop all of those processes of integration with the EU, and probably also with NATO, which will be like a nightmare, especially in Moscow. Moreover, I will also add that for Russia's perspective, the success story of all of those countries also will be such kind of nightmare, because it will be the best evidence that in the post-Soviet space, I'm nowadays excluding the Baltic states, that it will be possible to gather success story. And it will be a very visible signal for Russia society that they can achieve more or less the same, is one issue. Second issue is that we also have to think about Russia way of thinking about all of those imperial ideology, something which we call, which we know as Ruski Mir, when Russia tried to use rather hard power, not soft power, to attract countries in something which is called by Moscow's elite like their closest neighborhood. We also have to think about Russian point of view of this geopolitical way of thinking about the vision of the world, which is divided in this plenty of sphere of influence, in which countries like the US, for instance, cannot interfere in something which is called Russian sphere of influence, and something which is very dangerous, especially from Central European perspective, is that in the middle of those sphere of influence, there are also countries which belong to so-called gray zones, which should be, from Russian perspective, a buffer zone states. And nowadays we also see this in this Russian state MFA statement, in which they are wanting from NATO that in the eastern flank countries there should be no military drills, and all kind of military equipment should be more or less withdraw, because all kind of military equipment should be dangerous dangerous to Russia. Then we will have also to think about how those conflicts will evaluate in the future, because we rather don't have any doubts that they will be used by Russia in the future, and not only them, not only those protracted conflicts, because we also think about Belarus, which nowadays, fortunately for Belarus, doesn't have such kind of protracted conflict with the engagement of Russia, but it doesn't mean that it won't be used. It will be. We also have to look at the human rights situation there, when we have like almost 900 political prisoners still in Belarusian prisons, and also using migrants as a kind of weapon, also violating human rights by Belarusian regime. So we also will have to think of that, and that probably Russia will also try to use Belarus to engage it in its protracted conflicts with Ukraine, especially in Donbas. Those conflicts will be instrumentalized and used by Russia in its way of leading diplomacy, something which Mark Galotti called heavy metal diplomacy. But definitely Russia wants to be perceived as a superpower, someone who is able to solve the conflicts. But what a surprise, the conflicts which were artificially created by them. One thing, maybe not one thing, definitely one thing more is that all of those way of policy, it's also a test for Western unity, a test for the EU and NATO. The more that now, and also for SCEEUS as a security organization, what is interesting, Russia mentioned plenty of times OSCE in its statement, but just only those points about security. They said nothing about human rights, which are one of the main pillar, if not the main one, in the OSCE. Just to sum up, definitely Russia will use all kinds of weaknesses from Western side, and moreover, we also have to think about something which to some extent is connected with protracted conflicts. I mean, all of those hybrid tools and hybrid issue, because they were tested, they were practiced, especially in these areas, these countries of protracted conflicts, like information warfare with Ukraine, like using the possibility to stop shifting hydrocarbons to Ukraine or to Georgia, and plenty of other issues connected with attacking critical infrastructure, with interfering in political system, with economic blackmailing, and so forth, so on, that we as Western countries probably will also have to tackle with such kind of behaving and threats coming directly from Russia. So I think that when we are learning those protracted conflicts, we also have to think about all of those which we nowadays called hybrid threats, and think about the Western European countries and the security of the EU and NATO. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And now over to Marek Menkishak, head of the Russian department at the Center for Eastern Studies. Thank you. Marek, please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. I'm very privileged to participate in this event. My problem actually is that after reading the final report, I cannot find anything I disagree with. So let me first tackle several points that I would like to underline, and I think they are actually to some extent within the report. One thing I like very much with the report is that there is an ambiguous sort of assessment of Russia's role, which is pretty much negative for the security situation. Russia is obviously a challenge, which is probably an understatement for many OSCE members. Russia is basically a threat for security. And it is very important to stress that there is no symmetry here, because it's quite often that we approaching this with some artificial symmetries, basically blaming two sides, Russia and the West, actually conflicting with each other, and actually, and that we need to respond to that by compromises on both sides. I don't think, I disagree with that. I don't think there is a symmetry. What Russia has done to European security for the last couple of years cannot be matched by any Western policies, any NATO policies, any EU policies, and any policies of Russia's neighbors. Second point is that it is very important, rightly, to stress an huge impact of the so-called protracted conflicts on the overall security beyond the regions. It is very much important. So we cannot and we shouldn't actually think that it is possible to compartmentalize relations with Russia, actually without any need to find solutions to those protracted conflicts. It is not possible to bypass them, basically, in relations with Russia. The third point is that it is very rightly and importantly to stress the interlink between Russia's foreign and security policy and Russia's internal developments. These are closely interlinked, and the fact that Russia as a state is increasingly authoritarian, it's actually morphing itself into a strong dictatorship with some totalitarian ambitions, actually very strongly increases the aggressive nature of Russia's foreign and security policy. And it is also important because we should not expect those phenomena to change in a foreseeable future. As long as the current system of government, as the current regime, both in terms of institutions and personnel, exists in Russia, we should not have hopes that there will be any substantial change to Russia's modus operandi, referring to European security. Another important element is that that we should, in responding to the Russia's challenge, we should tackle the basics, return to the basics, to the basic principles. And we should not allow actually to think that certain demands which are posed by Russia, which are in direct contravene to basic principles of the OSCE, are legitimate, because there is a certain tendency that, well, we should discuss the Russian demands would, however they are, just automatically. I don't think so. It is the question of legitimacy of certain Russian demands. And finally, it is the report and issues which are raised are very topical. They are very topical because we currently facing the situation in which Russia poses us with a sort of an ultimatum, actually, threatening use of force. This is actually sometimes indirect, but it is very real, a threat of using force by Russia, which by itself also contravenes the basic principles of the OSCE. And finally, in terms of recommendations, I also like the principal approach to those recommendations. So first of all, kind of refusal of accepting certain notions of the de facto spheres of influence, which actually Russia demands as its goal. It is impossible to agree to that. It is important to think about possible sanction regimes, the closing loopholes in existing sanction regimes, to increase application of new instruments of sanctions, including relating to the human rights, and also to preemptively communicate substantial economic sanctions whenever the further aggression, especially towards Ukraine recently, is to be executed by Russia. But also understanding that, of course, the dialogue is needed with Russia, and we cannot refuse to have a dialogue with Russia, and it should be continued on the existing formats. So we have OSCE, we have a NATO-Russia Council, we have US-Russia dialogue, we have a Normandy format, we have all these formats, and there is actually no need to design anything out of the blue in relation to dialogue with Russia. I would like to point out just to the two small cases, the two elements which I think we should be explore in more depth. One is the thing that we should return to a discussion about the peacekeeping operation in Donbass. If we really think about making a progress in fulfillment of the Minsk Agreements, however imperfect they are, there is no other way actually than to address the basic security deficit. And the only way actually to have a chance to develop the political track which Russia demands within the Minsk format is actually to agree upon the interim period which would introduce a basic security, but it is only possible with the participation of UN or OSCE mandated and administered fully fledged peacekeeping operation within the region. So that's one point. And the second point, we have to reinforce our proposals. Some of them, for example, has been presented to Russia by NATO, to making an overall of the OSCE Vienna document about the security, confidence and security building measures. We have to understand that certain proposals, a lot of proposals has been refused by Moscow, but we should reinforce them and we should make them publicly visible. The part of the problem, I think, is that some our proposals, some our initiatives are not enough communicated to the public. We need more strategic communication, which also could influence our dialogue with Russia. And I will stop that and possibly developing some issues in further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Marek, and thank you especially for your last two very concrete ideas and proposals here. It has been mentioned here that the OSCE is a main actor in the forum in many of these aspects. It could be argued that the OSCE has three main assets. The first one, it's a normative asset. The OSCE is the normative base for the European Security Order. Hence, the final act, Paris Charter, has been mentioned, but also a whole series of other commitments, which have all been decided by consensus, and including by Russia. The second asset is the OSCE as a dialogue platform. This is an organization, the world's largest regional security organization, which meets regularly and offers a platform for dialogue between the participating states. And the third asset is its toolbox. We have the institutions, autonomous institutions dealing, for instance, with democracy, institutions of democracy and human rights, freedom of media. But we also have some of these military confidence and security building measures that Marek mentioned, like the Vienna document. And it can also be noted that the Vienna document, which should allow observation by foreign military observers when there is military exercises activities exceeding 13,000 men defined in a certain way, should be allowed. No Russian military exercises so far has been organized or communicated in such a way that they have been observed under the Vienna document. But my question here is how do we deal with the situation here when OSCE is in charge of these conflicts and the conflict negotiations and the mechanisms and the formats? But it's also here the aggressor and the violator, and how do we deal with this in a consensus-based organization? Is there tensions between the normative value of the OSCE, upholding these principles and commitments, and the pragmatic need to act, to have a special monitoring mission, or to have dialogue? And if so, how do we deal with this? How do we strike a balance between dialogue and accountability, as it were? Any thoughts on that? John, please.
Thanks. I'd like to start with picking up something that was mentioned by Anna-Maria, namely unity. And I think that really needs to be stressed here in terms of sticking together. The EU and NATO, within the EU, of course, we need to stick together. We need to keep the transatlantic link strong. We need to also work together with like-minded allies and partners, the UK, Canada, Norway, Switzerland, and so on and so forth. If we don't do that, we're almost doomed already from the beginning. We will then be divided on purpose and played out against each other. And I think this is particularly important to stress in times like this, when we have a new German government. Berlin has a big responsibility to keep the EU together, together with France, where we have presidential elections coming up next year. This will be very important. I'm happy that Foreign Minister Baerbock and Chancellor Scholz have already visited Warsaw. I think it's important to have Poland on board on this in the Weimar format or somehow else. There are many reasons for this. Poland borders Ukraine, Poland borders Belarus. In both countries, what happens affects Poland. And there's also a link between developments in Belarus and what Russia is doing towards Ukraine. And then, of course, next year, Poland will be chairing the OSCE. So there are all kinds of reasons to keep Poland on board. And I'd like to see more of that in the transatlantic dimension as well, actually. We've seen in the last few days and weeks sort of coordination between Washington and European cities. I think there are many reasons. The ones I just mentioned, that Warsaw should have been included there as well. The EU as well, I think would have been appropriate. I hope we will see that going ahead. And then, of course, unity also with the affected countries. Nothing about them without them, it's sometimes said. And of course, everything needs to be very closely coordinated with Kiev, Tbilisi, Chisinau, and so on. So that's one spontaneous point. And I think also just what we do outside of the OSCE also matters within the OSCE. To think that we can solve things only within the OSCE without considering sanctions, for example, that are then decided upon outside of the OSCE, that would be naive. There are also other instruments outside of the OSCE that we also need to consider to reinforce what happens within the OSCE. But I'll let the others in.
Thank you. Marek and Anna Maria, I mean, what Poland is soon to assume the chairpersonship of the OSCE. What are the recommendations that you would give in Warsaw to your government and your foreign ministry on this? And what is the room for maneuver for an OSCE chairpersonship? Anyone wants to comment on that? Anna Maria.
So maybe I will start, because nevertheless it's a very tough question and difficult recommendation. Of course, as I'm not mistaken, Poland will focus on SMM mission in Donbass and in situation in Ukraine, because as John mentioned before, it's not about Ukraine, it's about whole region, and probably not only the whole region, but security in transatlantic world as such. It's one issue. Second issue is, of course, also using OSCE mechanism in other places when protracted conflicts are ongoing, especially in Nagorno-Karabakh, and also in Moldova and in Transnistria, which is also very important because we are seeing how Russia is involved on those conflicts, and how Russia is trying to use them for its political aims, especially in international area. So, but on the other hand, it will be extremely difficult to talk about such kind of issues within OSCE. As you, Frederick, mentioned, consensus is needed here. So it's not only Russia who can block any kind of activities, any kind of solving problems, but also Belarus, who is also among OSCE countries, who will act in a pair with Russia. We also have to think about cooperation with other OSCE countries, like, for instance, Kazakhstan, which wasn't mentioned and which has its own interest, and to be very honest, not in 100% connected with Russian aims. So very difficult year that it's among us, with plenty of how to say, traps. But also I think that Marek was totally right that we have to speak more publicly about all of those proposals connected with Vienna document, which is last in which Russia is officially engaged, because Russia withdrew its engagement from Open Sky Treaty and CFE Treaty, which deteriorate the security instruments in the past. And also to stress that we have security architecture which was established in 90s, and we don't have to think about any other of architecture, just maybe to return to all of those which was signed between then USSR, now Russia, and other countries about, for instance, measures of control. So definitely we also have to be more visible in presenting our proposals for instance, in regards to reforming Vienna document, which to some extent also is an answer, even I will say that pre-answer of Russian demands, because Russian MFA said about this that we have to think about warships and war aircrafts and about this dangerous incidents, and one of and that we should avoid that kind of incidents. And one of the proposals of this reforming Vienna document is just to do so, and for instance to stop flying without transponders on. So that's our proposals, and I think that in Poland and should be more active, probably also in public.
Thank you, Anna. Marek, you already mentioned two concrete proposals on the peacekeeping operations in Donbass and also on the military confidence building. But are there other? How do you assess and how would you advise the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs now, assuming how can we use, or how can the OSCE be used here, so to say? Or is it helpful, or do we have to look for other instruments?
Well, I would advise certainly that we should keep our ambitions and hopes quite low for obvious reasons. We all witnessed in recent years that Russia has been playing a very non-constructive role within the OSCE, basically blocking a lot, paralyzing partly some OSCE activity, including in relation to monitoring missions. We have to be aware of that, and we have to be aware of that the nature of the OSCE as a basically consensus-based, broad membership structure creates serious difficulties in overcoming the deadlocks which are appearing. So the right approach, and I think the Polish government fully realizes that, is a small steps approach. And also those actual elements I mentioned, both the Vienna document discussion and the discussion about potential operations with the OSCE role, including in Donbass, are possibly the ways to create a room for progress in that respect, without possibly putting too much hopes, because we understand that there are some very strict Russian positions which are very much unhelpful in terms of possible effective progress in that respect. But I also would like to touch upon the question which appeared within the chat, and which are related to a dialogue platforms also with Russia. So I mentioned Normandy format not because I'm especially fond of it and especially recognizing the effectiveness of this. My intention was to suggest that we have already plenty of existing formats to discuss with Russia. And actually, we have to be cautious in designing, new series of some avenues of discussion. For example, some people may suggest that the current consultation format between the US and several major allies within Europe are probably the possible new format for discussion with Russia. I would be very much urging against that because we have to understand that it is impossible to really tackle the serious issues of European security and serious matters of Ukraine and Ukraine relations with Russia and conflict in Donbass without participation of the Eastern flank, NATO Eastern flank countries and Ukraine itself. So this is very, I think, important point I would like to make. The second element to this is that there has been, of course, talks about possible merger of two tracks existing on Donbass, which is Normandy format and US-Russia bilateral dialogue. I think that can be discussed. Definitely, I think Ukraine would welcome the US participation in Normandy talks. And I understand even Russia, formally at least, has not denied such possibility. It is the matter of discussion, but it is extremely important, actually, not to try bypass Ukraine in any format of this kind of negotiations, because we have to understand there is a full political subjectivity of Ukraine in the process. We cannot and we shouldn't at any time suggest that there is a possibility of a kind of limited sovereignty of Ukraine being discussed. There is no such issue. It shouldn't be, and this is a matter of principle in terms of approach to this particular issue.
Thank you. Picking up on exactly this topic, question. I mean, it's sometimes by some stated in the discussion that that Russia's goals and aims and Kremlin's and Putin's goals and aim are somewhat mysterious and that they are difficult to understand, and so forth. Whether others, including myself, would argue they are very clearly stated, and they have been so since the Medvedev initiative. And there has been also follow-up discussion formats. We had within the OSCE, there was the Corfu process, there was the Helsinki Plus 40, there was the panel of eminent persons, and now again a new formulation of this was then made on the end of last week by the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs on their homepage, where they also, in the English translation, said that Russia will shortly present draft international legal documents in the indicated areas to launch talks in respective formats. So the aims, Russians' aims and goals seem to be clear, and there have also been moving forward, not least during the last months, so to say, in relationship to Ukraine. And we don't only have a sort of military escalation, but we also have a sort of political escalation and in terms of the Russian demands. And as you pointed out, Marek, once you start to toy with these ideas of limited sovereignty, that you actually have established spheres of interest and influence, that some countries are more sovereign than others, and larger military capable great powers have the right or the veto on foreign and security policy and also domestic policy issues of other countries. And once, of course, you have established this principle or legitimized this aberration from the current order, then we have undermined this order. But the question is, why now? Why is this Russian escalation coming now towards Ukraine? Which is, as we have seen by these demands, this is much more about Ukraine. It is about veto on various countries' defense capabilities, on their right to choose their own security and foreign and security policy arrangements, which is a key principle of the Paris Charter. But why is this going on right now, and why with such intensity? How can we understand that? Any comments on that? Anna Maria, please.
Okay, thank you, Friedrich. I think that there are plenty of answers to your question, and we can divide them into two boxes. One box which is connected with internal situation in Russia, and second box which is connected with external policy of these countries. So starting with the first one, we have to think about decreasing popularity of Vladimir Putin. Last Levada survey just shown that it's like 31 or 35%, if I'm not mistaken, which is the lowest results on the history of making surveys about the popularity of Vladimir Putin. So to some extent, Kremlin's elites are seeking any possibilities to maybe not to grab the social popularity, but to focus society attention to some other issue. The second thing which is connected with that, it's a question of maintaining the high readiness of Russian army and Russian armed forces. And that's why they are organizing plenty of those kind of troops shifting, and they're keeping the military forces in very high level of readiness. And that's why it's also so huge engagement from Russian side. And jumping to this the second box about external situation, we have a situation in which Russia is trying to undermine also deteriorating position of President Vladimir Zelensky in Ukraine. Is trying to use all kind of weaknesses of this country is one issue. Second issue is, of course, about testing the new American administration, because the tension started in April this year, just a few months after Joe Biden started to be the president. So it's the second issue. Third issue is, of course, connected with elections in Germany, and nowadays the situation connected with Nord Stream 2. Also, next year election in France was mentioned. So I think that it's also a kind of testing. And last but not least, we have to think about internal situation in NATO, about our internal discussion about new strategic concept, that we will have to face the election of new SecGen in the middle of next year. So all of those Russia is trying to use. And one thing to add, it's also trying to use increasing dependence of Belarus from itself. So here we have the whole spectrum of answers why it's happening now.
Thank you, Anna Maria, for a very clearly structured and exhaustive answer. Andreas, please, additions to this?
Yes, I want to just add to what Anna Maria said, this domestic aspect. The frightening thing here is that the last two large such escalations in 2008 and 2014, they both led then to a rise of Putin's popularity, to a rise of anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, also to a lowering of the popularity, the traditionally high popularity of the European Union, and the lessons that sort of Putin is learning from these earlier armed conflicts is that it's good domestically, and it's also in terms of foreign policy not particularly problematic, because after the 2008 Russian-Georgian war, we had actually an improvement of the relations between Russia and the West. We had the reset policy of the US, we had the modernization partnership, first from Germany and then from the entire EU towards Russia. So in a way, you got a prize for the transgression and for the non-fulfillment also of the so-called Sarkozy plan, the Russian-Georgian ceasefire agreement. And then there's also, I think, the inner Ukrainian factor in that until 2019, I guess Putin was waiting for a new president after the hawkish Poroshenko. And then the new president came, and indeed there were certain signs that the new president would actually be more conciliatory towards Russia. There was then, for instance, again, the discussion about the Steinmeier formula. But over the months, it turned out actually that Zelensky is as hawkish, and in some regards even more hawkish than Poroshenko, in that he, for instance, closed the pro-Russian TV channels linked to Viktor Medvedchuk, actually a sort of relative of Putin, and that it did not actually, the change of the leadership in Ukraine, improve the relations, and that there is, so to say, no immediate victory to be obtained by Putin via sort of this Russian-Ukrainian diplomatic or political confrontation, but only through the West, that is now sort of being asked to renounce its earlier obligations towards Ukraine, or through military escalation. So I think, you know, Putin is again looking for a victory like in 2008 and 2014. It doesn't have to be a military victory necessarily, but it should be certainly some victory. And that is also then, I think, putting the West in a very difficult situation, because if you want to prevent war, you have to sort of give Putin at least an opportunity to save his face, to give him some sort of victory. But that should be then a victory, preferably not at the expense of Ukraine. So that is, I think, the dilemma that the West is now in.
Thank you, Marek.
Thank you. I fully agree with my colleagues. There are several elements to the situation, I believe. So, on one hand, Russia is not accepting status quo. Russia is not accepting status quo in Ukraine. Russia is not accepting status quo in European security. And those hopes and those attempts Russia has made in both cases has failed. There is a deadlock in Donbass, which Russia could not overcome. The pressure for Ukraine has not produced results welcomed by Russia. There is increasing cooperation between Ukraine and the West, and the small steps in the process of integration. This is directly against the Russian interests. We have the slowly increasing presence of NATO in the eastern flank. We have a discussion about new strategic concept and new operational plans by NATO, which actually recognizes Russia as a threat. Russia tries to challenge that. Russia tries to overcome that. Russia tries to change the dynamics. The second part, the second element is a certain window of opportunity Russia sees, in my perception. And there are, again, several elements to those. One is the energy crisis in Europe, the hike of prices, which both makes Russia more bold and makes Russia thinks that it can survive possible sanction response by the West through the building huge reserves, which Russia is doing now currently. But also it in Russian perception, this crisis makes more difficult, especially for Europe, to respond to the Russian challenge. And also we have a political dynamic, which is very interesting and which Russia very much monitors. So the new government in Germany and kind of perceived maybe relative weakness of Germany currently, presidential campaign in France, and last but not least, new Biden administration increasingly focused on China and preoccupied with the Asia Pacific. So in that respect, I believe Russians believe that there is this window of opportunity for them and they have to act now. before it will be too late, before the situation will be much more worse for the Russian interests, and before the long-term trends will make Russia even more weaker than it is now.
Thank you, Mari. And John, quickly, and then we will go to the final round of questions.
Yes, very shortly. I can't add any more reasons than the others just said. That was very exhaustive. But I just wanted to stress how serious and worrying the Russian rhetoric is as well, with Putin comparing the situation in Eastern Donbass to a genocide, which is a word that we also heard in 2008 to justify the Russian military intervention in Georgia. Who knows what the potential military goals would be for Russia, but it can't be excluded that there are such as well, and that we will once again be taken by surprise. And I think linking this to Marek's idea of a peacekeeping operation, I mean, if there are such serious allegations being put forward, the response should be to demand free access for the special monitoring mission of the OSCE all over Ukraine's territory. It could also justify a proper UN mandated peacekeeping operation that would also then have a mandate to cover the whole of the territory, not just some sort of reinforced division of Eastern Donbass from the rest of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. We have slightly less than 10 minutes left of this webinar. We have some more questions here from the audience, and one that Marek partly touched upon from Olga Sokolova. And it's about the dialogue with Russia. How useful do you think the existing challenges are, Normandy formats, etc.? And looking at where Europe stands now, doesn't it look like continuous dialogue with Russia by means of existing challenge approaches is not really functioning? And how can we evaluate the trustworthiness of the Russian government as a negotiation party? And also, since it has violated its promises and international agreements earlier. And would this situation merit a tougher reaction from the EU? We have another question from Olesia Ponomarenko, who is about the possibility, the legal ways of recognizing the war in Donbass as an international armed conflict, with Russia as a belligerent party under international humanitarian law, and that this would open up for also better protection of human rights and humanitarian issues such as prisoners of war, investigate war crimes and so forth. And I can just also say that our last report that will be published later on this week will exactly touch upon these issues, the complexities of international law, and so forth. And then we have a third question about the role. What can the role of civil society be in situations like this? And civil society is also having limited resources. What should the civil society focus on? And I suggest that with these questions and the previous questions we've had here, that we now go for a final round of comments from our panelists. And you're feel free to touch on any of these questions or any other of the points that were made in the discussion so far. And I suggest then that maybe we this time go in reverse order, which means that you would have approximately 1 minute each. Marek, what are your last words in this discussion?
Thank you very much, Frederick. I would not repeat what I've already said in response to an issue of Normandy format. My point basically is that we should not try to reinvent the wheel. We have abundance of format. It is no necessity actually to find this many new ones. And we have to basically try to maybe add some initiatives to these, and I mentioned the two. I mentioned the peacekeeping, Actually, those are related to the second question. It is about how we should trust the Russia. Well, we have to try Russia. I mean, we have to test Russia. So if Russia genuinely has a goodwill and seeking risk reduction and seeking kind of avoiding conflict and finding political solutions, the both peacekeeping operation, which I would like to remind you already been extensively discussed, especially between US and Russia before, and the issue of Vienna document reform and enhancement actually are perfect as a test cases posed to Russia. This is the way we first underline that we are constructive in our approach. We are forthcoming, and actually we are putting the ball on the Russia's court. It is for Russia actually to prove that it is genuinely constructive in its approach.
Thank you. Anna Maria, please.
Okay, I'll try to be extremely short. So starting with the question of international law, nowadays definitely we have a problem with defining status between peace and war. And we have such kind of problem with Ukraine because it's Ukraine who should, as a first country, perceived that it's in a state of war with Russia, which will change maybe not everything, but plenty of issues over there because of plenty of political and also social reasons. The authorities in Kiev didn't do so, but still we think about other our issues within the EU and within NATO, to what extent and when we have to respond in everything which is in between and in everything which we called hybrid threats and hybrid warfare tools, because it will be also important to us to know when and to what extent we should react on that. And second question about civil society, it could be engaged in every kind of protracted conflicts. We spoke about it during some side events during the Osce summit in Stockholm almost 2 weeks ago. And definitely civil society can be used in preventing conflict as a part of observing and helping observing missions. And moreover, in peace building, I will stop here because it's a very huge issue for the discussion, but definitely there is a huge importance of civil society and NGOs in this part of the world and in protracted conflicts. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Maria. And I think the engagement and role of civil society is worth a webinar and reports in its own, so to say. So, John.
Thanks. Well, clearly we need communication channels with Russia, and I wouldn't propose creating any new ones here on the spot, but it's important to remember that some of these formats for different conflict resolution processes are not reflecting realities. Russia gets to play a mediator or facilitator or participate in some undefined role. We need to be clear about who the conflict parties are, where responsibility lies, and we must avoid letting Russia set the agenda. Russia has been very clear what it thinks about the Normandy format by publishing correspondence, confidential diplomatic correspondence with Berlin and Paris. And now we have a typical problem of Russia creating a problem and then demanding concessions from us in order to solve that problem. A bit like the mafia does in certain films. And we need to stop playing along with that. Now we have a discussion about the concessions, accommodation of Russia, and so on and so forth. We should go back to to the fundamental principles and commitments that we have agreed upon within the OSCE, the ones that exist in international law. The problem is not the rule book, it's that Russia violates these rules. We can also look at the Minsk Agreements. When we do that, we tend to look at things like local elections in eastern Ukraine, special status for Donbass, and so on and so forth, and forget about points affecting Russia and these illegal structures in eastern Ukraine. There are very clear points in these agreements about the removal of unlawful military formations and military hardware, about the withdrawal of all foreign armed formations, disarmament of all illegal groups. When was the last time you heard a Western politician stress this point of the Minsk Agreement? So let's back that dialogue up with the right messages and with other measures. It could be things like security and defense support to Ukraine. Ukraine has the right to self-defense according to the UN Charter. They have the right to ask for assistance, and we have the right to deliver that assistance. Let's consider that. And we should also, of course, continue long-term with our support for Ukraine and other affected countries to promote their democratic and economic development in general. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas.
Yeah, we raised already the issues of the international organizations and the formats. And I would agree here with John Zachau's conclusions that often then these formats become a problem in itself. Still, sometimes there are issues, there are certain initiatives that then actually still, oddly in a way, you could say, produce useful results, like the special monitoring mission that is accumulating now a huge amount of data that will be certainly used in the future for research and also perhaps for legal affairs. The European Court on Human Rights is still producing decisions that are useful for the issues that we are discussing here. Or the UN Commissioner on Human Rights has actually published also on the, for instance, the Izolatia torture prison in Donetsk. And these are, of course, all organizations where Russia is present. And oddly, because Russia wants to be part of these international structures, it wants to be seen as a great power and even as a European power, sometimes these organizations can produce useful results. But often we will have to resort back then, because Russia can then boycott sort of or sabotage sort of the work of these organizations, to coalitions of the willing. We have now the Lublin Triangle in place. There are other perhaps initiatives where Poland is a part, which could be extended to countries like Ukraine, like the Three Seas initiatives, or perhaps even the Bucharest 9 group. And so we need to be here very flexible in terms of the organizations and formats and initiatives that can be used. And maybe in conclusion, I just want to mention Crimea. I think Crimea is very important, is the sort of looming issue behind here, because I think the presidency of Putin, in his view, is very much determined by the annexation of Crimea. Now it turns out that the sort of previous rule that imperial customary law goes before international law, as we saw with Transnistria, Abkhazia, the Trinvali region, is not working out with Crimea. There's now the Crimea platform. The Western countries are not agreeing to this. We have each year we have a resolution of the UN on Crimea, and there are also problems with Crimea, like the freshwater supply. And my feeling is that what we are observing now here is a big operation in the end to secure Crimea, and that sort of to get to some sort of deal where then Crimea could remain a part of Russia.
Thank you, Andreas. And also on the latter, the issues here that was mentioned here on Eastern Europe and Ukraine, I'd just like to remind our viewers that we have a report published recently and also a webinar last week, which can be viewed on the UI Facebook and should be available on the homepage soon, about realizing the vision of a Europe whole, free and at peace, a new strategic approach to the Eastern neighborhood. The report is authored by Andreas Omland and Hugo von Essen at the Stockholm Centre for Eastern European Studies. With these words, a very warm thanks to all our panelists and especially our cooperation partners, Anna Maria Dünner from PISM in Warsaw, and Marek Minkishak from the OSW, also in Warsaw. And we hope to stay in contact on this topic and other topics also during next year. But it was really great to do this webinar discussion in cooperation with you. And also a special thank to John Sachow for writing and publishing the summary report, and not least to Dr. Andreas Umland and Martin Krag, who is not here with us today, for initializing and taking the initiative for this report series and flagship project. This webinar today has also been recorded and can be viewed, will be available on the UI homepage shortly, and also on the UI Facebook page. Please, this is our last planned webinar from the Stockholm Centre of Eastern European Studies for this year. But who knows? There's a lot of things going on, and we will come back reinforced next year with a series of webinars and seminars and report series. And so keep out looking for that, and please have a closer look at the reports that has been published in this series so far. They contain a wealth of detail, and also in terms of policy recommendations. And I would also like to extend a warm thank you to Hedvig Pettersson, who is a Centrum coordinator, and without whom none of this would have been possible, neither today's webinar nor the report series. With that, it's a little bit too early maybe to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year, but I hope to see you all, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you from Stockholm for joining us today.